Howdy YouTube, and welcome to this episode of the Gunman. So this video here is part 1 on an insane custom respray on this WRX. So some of you may have actually already seen a bit of a sneak peek preview type video that I've already done on this, and it was just a little bit of a look at each stage. I put that together and I put some music over the top of that, but we're gonna go right through and do a full video series on it and go more into depth on each stage. So it's a 96 WRX, and the owner of this is a big Gunman fan. He saw a video that I put up a couple of years ago, and it was a black base followed by some coarse metal flakes, and then I actually put some candy apple red over the top of it, and then lots of clear. And he liked that so much that he decided he wanted his entire car done like that. So yeah, this was one hell of a project, and as you can see, like, the panels, they're not bad, they're not that bad, but they've just got like small dents and ripples the whole way through them. So it took me a fair while to block them down. So what I decided to do was, for the bigger ones, I did fill them in, but for most of those small ones, I just blocked them out in the material that was on the car. So this metallic red that you see is actually not even the original paint. The original paint is what you see there in the engine bay, and that's actually a solid red. So originally from factory, this was a solid red. He then got it painted in the early 2000s, like a full in and out respray, except for the engine bay in that metallic red. So yeah, it's got a couple of paint jobs worth of material on there. So that's why I decided to just get the long blocks onto them and use the material that we had. And that was just a quick look at the test panel. So that's one thing that I highly recommend doing if you do go and do any custom paint work, or specifically big jobs. Make sure that you know the color that you're going to get. So do a big panel. That's why I did an entire guard. So I started off by doing some small, like, you've got these little car shapes. So I started off by doing a few of them. So I got the basic idea, but before I went for the entire respray, I wanted to do a full panel. It also gives you a bit of a practice. You can start writing the procedure down. I do recommend doing that. So yeah, do yourself a test panel and write down the procedure. Now, no doubt it might change a little bit because, you know, spray painting, it doesn't always go to plan, and sometimes you do have to sort of kind of make it up as you go, I guess. But all of that aside, as you can see here, I've just got the big long block onto these doors and just got some 80 grit on there as well. And there was just hours after hours after hours of blocking. So I do recommend, if you can, get a long block like what I've got. So I was lucky to have these Pinky's blocks sent out. They're really good. He gave like a full set of them, and this is the ultra long block. I don't use this on most repairs, but for this kind of job, absolutely ideal. They're Velcro. They actually are dustless, so I can hook it up to the vacuum cleaner if I want to, but sometimes those hoses can just be annoying. And as you can see, I've got like full prep bays underneath me, so a bit of dust down there, it all goes straight out of your face anyway. Another thing, before I started this job, I made a request to the boss. I said, please, can I just get the good 3M purple Cubitron and the 3M purple clean sanding discs to do this job, because we use like some, they were called like Sunmite or something, I don't know, like they were really terrible sanding discs, and they literally just don't cut it. So I do highly recommend getting the top quality sandpapers, because it really does make a difference. Like it cuts in for longer, and you really need that cut. So all that aside, this is the first prime, and considering it's the first prime, it's not too bad. Like, I always went into this job expecting to have to prime it twice, so I knew there was going to be a few little bits here and there that I might have to refill, and definitely a full reprime. So I did have to reprime all of the panels. I then blocked them back again, and then if I cut through anywhere, there was just a spot prime after that. So there was actually sections that got a third shot with the primer. But yeah, have a look at that bonnet. That was one of the worst panels on it. It's one of those things that it was so badly faded, there was no real gloss on it. You couldn't see how bad it was originally. but it really wasn't that good. But as you can see, the rest of them, they're not that bad. It was mainly small ones that did come out with a good block down. So I just originally I hit it with 80 grit, I then went 120 grit and then 180 grit and primed over the 180 grit. Another thing I was mindful of was not to have the primer too thick and not to use too low pressure with your primer. I've seen it in the past. I've seen people treat resprays like workshop putty ups, and they're not. Like, so a respray like this, you want to get this as straight as possible. You want as little ripples in it as possible, right? So when you go and use low pressure with thick primer, you put orange peel into it. Now the reason we do that on small repairs is because you get more material on. So that's okay as long as you block it down properly. But it seems, for whatever reason, once you do that on full panels, it can be really hard to get rid of that orange peel. That's why I do recommend, look, you still need a bit of build on these panels, right? Just put an extra couple of coats on if you have to. Go 5 coats need be. I did still just go for 4 coats on most of it. But I could see that there was a couple of sections that was going to need a little bit more, so I put the 5th coat, but just on those sections that I knew was going to need a bit more, because you also do have to think about, you don't want too much material on there. Now look, when you're doing a job like this, sure, you've got to expect that you're going to have a lot of material on there, but still, where possible, try to keep it to a minimum, because when you do get too much material, it is more prone to delaminate, and when it does chip, it'll go and chip really in large sections. So once this job was all finished, I got the boss to get his micrometer out, which is a paint thickness gauge. It'll actually tell you how thick the paint is. And most of it was 600. There was a couple of spots that was up to 700. But I was actually expecting it to be more than that, to be honest, with the amount of coats of primer I put on, the amount of coats of clear I put on. It got a flow coat, all of the flakes. Yeah, I was expecting it to be a bit more. But yeah, it got up to 650 or 700 microns. So to put that in perspective, most cars, I think they're about 160 to 200. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's about where they're at. Most factory paint work is up around. So yeah, it's a good, 3 or 3.5 times a normal car. But considering it's a candy over flakes respray, I didn't think it was too bad. And I think little things like having the high pressure when I did the primer work and not having it too thick, getting sort of relatively thin coats on, but enough where you need it still, I think that definitely helped. So once I did get it primed, I just started hitting it with 120 the first time for the first block, and after I primed it the second time, I just hit it with 180. So yeah, that's not what you usually do on a normal car. You'll never usually hit your primer with 120 grit. And I know there might be some people out there that are saying, oh, you could do like polyester primer, but look, ultimately I decided just to do the standard polyurethane because it's what I'm used to. For me, polyester spray filler is for panels that are really, really bad. Another thing you probably noticed is that I've got those infrared drying lights out following me around as I'm going around the job, and that's just to make sure that the primer is fully cured before I go and block it, so that it's not going to be shrinking back. Well, I mean, it's always going to shrink back, but you want it to shrink back before you do your block work and before you paint it. You might have even noticed on one of those doors when I was giving you an initial look over it that there was a big section of shrink back. Now that was always going to happen, but what happened is, obviously when they went to paint it last time, they sanded it down, they probably primed it, but they painted over the primer when it was not fully cured. So when it did shrink back, it took the base coat and the clear coat from the final finish with it. So that's where the infrared drying lights come in handy. And also having a nice amount of thinners in your primer does help it dry as well. So again, that's where you don't want too much thinners in your primer. But as you can see there, I'm just checking it, giving it a wet check before sort of I continue on with the next stage and the next panel. So this job here, I had something like 8 or 9 hours of raw footage. So I might end up uploading some of that to my Raw channel. If you're not already subscribed to that, be sure to jump over. There's a link in the description, shameless plug to my second channel. But yeah, hopefully I've given you guys enough of a look at each stage that you get the basic idea of what I've done. So as I say, it was just a really good block down with 80 grit to start with. So I went 80, 120, 80. That's on the original paint. I obviously filled what I needed to fill. I then primed it, and as I mentioned before, I went 120 after the first prime, then 180, then re-primed it, and after the second prime I just went straight to the 180. And as you can see there, I hit it with some 320 grit on the orbital sander. I then did the edges. Now the edges took quite a fair bit of sanding. I actually had to hit them with 320 grit first because it got 2 primes, so the edges are really quite a fair bit thicker than usual. So I went 320, then 500 on the edges, and to finish it all off I hit it with the 500 grit orbital sander. Now I did that after I painted all the jams, but what I did, right, so I basically got all of the panels sanded, blocked, orbital sanded right up to the 320 grit stage. Then I painted all the jams. So once the jams were painted, I gave it back to the panel beaters. I said put the doors back on, and it really just needed like a final once over once all the door jams were painted and the doors were back on. So yeah, I just gave it a final once over, finished it off with 500 again on the orbital. I just checked over it, wet checked it. It turns out it did actually pick up a dent in one of the doors. So I thought about it, I'm like, man, I really don't want to go and like fill it again because they've been blocked so perfectly, right? They've been blocked end to end. And I'm like, how am I going to do it? And I said, you know what? Call up Luke. He's the local PDR guy. He's a good dude. I hope you're watching, Luke. Shout out to Luke, the PDR tech. But yeah, we just got him out, got him to push that dent up. He did a really good job. I said, look, push it a little bit high. I'd rather have it a little bit high than a little bit low. So he did, he pushed it a little bit high. I just got some 180 grit, blocked it back, got the orbital out again, got it up to 500 grit, wet checked it, and it was fine. So I didn't have any ripples. But I reckon if I had filled it, you're always going to sort of like scallop it out a little bit on the edges of the filler, and then you got to re-prime it, and to do it properly, you got to prime the whole panel, and then long block the whole panel again. So yeah, I'm pretty confident that I went the right way about picking up that little dent that we did find. As you can see, I scuffed all the door jams down. I just hit them with orbital sander where I could, but most of them I just hit them with 320 grit by hand, scuffed them all down. And the next video we're going to be getting the car into the booth and we will be spraying the door jams. So hope you guys have enjoyed watching this video. If you did, give it a big thumbs up. If you would like to support this show, be sure to check out the link in the description. There's loads of Gunman merchandise, including my personal favorite, those Gunman spray suits. I'd also like to say a big thanks to Nick, who is the owner of this car. Thanks for being such a good bloke, and the communication throughout the process has been great. He's been very helpful. And thank you for providing a canvas for me to do my artwork on.
Dripping lights paint the skies, all be